The night was thick with fog, and the pale moon hung high above, casting a silvery glow on the ancient city. Its cobblestone streets whispered secrets of centuries past, with shadows stretching like long, dark fingers along the buildings. Amongst these shadows, two worlds silently collided. A world of humans, fragile and fleeting, and a world of vampires, eternal and merciless. At the edge of the city, hidden within the depths of an old, crumbling mansion, a vampire named Alistair sat in a dimly lit room. His piercing gaze never left the window, where the faintest stirrings of a storm could be seen in the distance. He had lived for centuries, his existence a tangled mess of longing and bitterness. The vampires, once rulers of the night, were now but remnants of an ancient war that had left them scattered and hunted. The humans had claimed dominion over the world, and Alistair despised them for it. Yet, despite his hatred for the human race, there was something different about her. Her name was Elara. She was a human, young, vibrant, and full of life. A scholar, curious about the secrets of the world. And more than once, her research had led her to the forbidden subject of vampires. It was a topic that filled her with both awe and terror, but it was an obsession that she couldn't shake. One fateful evening, Elara ventured into the depths of the city, drawn to an old library that had long been abandoned by the living. She had heard rumors of the ancient texts hidden within its walls, texts that spoke of the true history of vampires, of their rise and fall, and the curse that bound them to the earth. She had no idea that the night she chose to seek knowledge would change her life forever. As Elara entered the library, her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she could feel the oppressive silence of the place wrapping around her. She had no idea that someone was watching her. Alistair, ever watchful of intruders, had been tracking her for weeks, intrigued by her relentless pursuit of vampire lore. When their eyes finally met, time seemed to stand still. Alistair's gaze was cold, predatory, but there was an unsettling flicker of something else, something he hadn't felt in centuries. And Elara, she was stunned, her heart racing as she realized that standing before her was no mere myth. "You shouldn't be here." Alistair's voice was like velvet, smooth yet chilling. Elara froze, her breath caught in her throat. Who are you?" His lips curled into a smirk. "I am the one you've been searching for." The encounter that night would mark the beginning of a dangerous and complicated bond between them. Elara, despite the fear that gripped her, was drawn to Alistair. She couldn't explain it, but she couldn't look away. His presence was overwhelming, and a part of her, deep within, longed to know more, to understand the ancient curse that had condemned him and his kind to the darkness. Alistair, on the other hand, was consumed by a mixture of contempt and fascination. He had sworn off human interaction long ago, but something about Elara's innocence, her ignorance, and her fear called to him. He should have killed her then, crushed her fragile existence beneath his heel. But instead, he allowed her to leave, knowing that this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Days turned into weeks, and their encounters grew more frequent. Alistair found himself reluctantly drawn to Elara, unable to resist her questions, her intellect, her insistence on uncovering the truths he had long buried. She, too, couldn't ignore the pull between them, an invisible thread that connected them in ways she couldn't understand. It was a dangerous dance, each of them caught in the tension between love and hatred, curiosity and fear. But as their connection deepened, the shadow of their inevitable conflict loomed ever closer. Alistair could feel the ancient bloodlust stirring herself unable to escape the grip Alistair had on her. She spent sleepless nights in her study, poring over every text she could find, every story about vampires, seeking the one thread that could unravel the mystery of her feelings. The more she learned about vampires, the more complex the situation became. The creatures that she once viewed as nothing more than myth were real, and one of them, Alistair, had captured her heart in a way she couldn't explain. But the fear never fully left her. She knew the consequences of being involved with a vampire, the danger that lingered in every shared glance, every whispered word between them. Alistair had made it clear that he could easily take her life. He was a predator, and she was prey. Yet, something in her resisted the idea of running away. Something pulled her back to him, as though their fates were already sealed, written in the stars. Meanwhile, Alistair, too, struggled with his emotions. He had fought for centuries to remain detached from humanity, to avoid the pain of connection and the vulnerability that came with it. The vampire world was one of power and fear, where emotions were weapons and weakness was exploited. He had no room for love, but every time he saw Elara, he felt his resolve weakening. She was different. Her beauty, her intelligence, and the fire in her heart stirred something deep within him. She challenged his cold indifference, and for the first time in centuries, Alistair felt as though he might want to be something more than a monster. One evening, as the sun began to set and the world was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Elara received a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was from Alistair. "Meet me tonight, the old church at midnight. Come alone." Elara's heart raced as she read the words. She had no idea what he wanted, but she knew she couldn't ignore the invitation. She prepared herself, slipping into her coat and gathering the courage to face it once more. The church, an ancient, decaying building at the edge of the city, was the last place anyone would expect to find life. But tonight, it would be the place where the line between love and hatred would blur even further. When Elara arrived at the church, the doors creaked open as if they were waiting for her. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, and the only light came from the faint glow of candles that lined the altar. And there, standing in the shadows, was Alistair. His eyes were cold, but there was something else in them. Something she hadn't seen before. Something like regret, or perhaps longing. "You came," he said softly, his voice a mixture of surprise and something darker. "I wasn't sure you would." Elara stepped forward, her pulse quickening. "What do you want from me, Alistair?" He remained silent for a moment, his gaze never leaving her. "I don't know anymore. I thought I could control it. Control this," he said, gesturing between them. "But every time I see you, I feel like I'm losing myself. You should hate me. You should fear me. But instead, you keep coming back." Elara took a step closer, her eyes locking with his. "I'm not afraid of you." His lips twitched, almost as if he were going to smile. "You should be, but I'm not." The air between them crackled with tension, and for a moment, it felt as though time stood still. Elara felt drawn to him, despite the danger, despite the centuries of hatred between their two kinds. She could sense his internal struggle, the pull between his nature and the desire for something more. She wondered if he could sense her own conflict, her growing feelings for him, mixed with the guilt and fear that kept her awake at night. "You don't understand," Alistair whispered, his voice low. "A bond like ours is forbidden. It's dangerous. It will destroy us both." "But I'm already here," Elara replied, her voice trembling but firm. "And I'm not leaving." The moment hung between them like a fragile thread, ready to snap at the slightest movement. They were so close, yet so far apart. A vampire and a human, one destined to live forever in darkness, the other with a short, fleeting life. But despite the distance between them, something undeniable lingered in the air, something more powerful than fear. It was the undeniable pull of fate, of desire, and of love in a world not exist. The following days were filled with tension. Alistair, despite his deep internal turmoil, continued to meet with Elara in secret. Their interactions grew more frequent, and with each passing day, their bond strengthened. But with that strength came inevitable danger. One evening, as Elara was leaving a local tavern, she was ambushed by a group of vampire hunters. Their eyes glinted with malice, their weapons sharp and deadly. They had heard whispers of a vampire-human relationship, and they were intent on putting an end to it before it could spread. Elara fought back, using every ounce of her strength and wit to evade them, but she was outnumbered. The hunters were closing in, and she knew she had no chance of escaping them on her own. That was when Alistair arrived, his figure appearing out of the shadows like a dark angel. His eyes burned with fury, and the air around him seemed to pulse with power. With a single motion, he took down the hunters, his speed and strength leaving them no chance to fight back. In a matter of seconds, they were all on the ground, unconscious or dead. Elara stood in awe, her heart pounding in her chest. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alistair's gaze softened for a brief moment, but then he turned away, his usual cold demeanor returning. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice detached. "You're not ready to face this world, Elara. You don't understand what you're getting yourself into." But despite his words, Elara knew one thing. No matter how dangerous it was, no matter how deep the hatred ran, she couldn't stay away from it. The days following the ambush left Elara shaken, but more determined than ever. The hunter's attack had opened her eyes to the cruel reality of the world she had stepped into. She couldn't afford to be naive anymore. The danger wasn't just around her. It was within the very person she had come to care about. Alistair was a creature of the night, a predator who had lived for centuries, and she was just a fleeting human in his world. But no matter how hard she tried to push him away, she knew deep down that she couldn't let him go. Her heart, though conflicted, only grew fonder of him. He had saved her. He had shown a side of himself that was vulnerable, something that no one else had seen. In a world where humans were prey, he had chosen to protect her. And still, the hatred between their worlds loomed large. There were whispers in the streets, rumors of a human and a vampire walking too close to the edge of an eternal abyss. There were those who would stop at nothing to destroy their bond, seeing it as an abomination that could threaten the fragile peace between vampires and humans. Elara couldn't hide forever. As much as she wanted to stay hidden in the shadows with Alistair, she knew that the outside world would soon take notice. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alistair and Elara met in the library, a place they had come to regard as their sanctuary. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken words, the tension palpable. Alistair leaned against one of the tall bookshelves, his arms crossed, his gaze distant. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, "about what happens next." Elara's heart raced, her throat tight. "What do you mean?" "I can't keep hiding from my kind forever. There are others who will come for you, Elara. The elders, the hunters. They'll stop at nothing to tear us apart. And if they do, they won't just come for you. They'll come for everyone you love." His words hit her like a blow, the weight of them suffocating her. She had known this day would come, but she hadn't expected it to arrive so soon. "I don't care what they do," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't care if they come for me. I won't run." Alistair's expression softened, his eyes full of sorrow and something else, something deeper. "You don't understand, Elara. You're in over your head. This is bigger than us." She took a step closer to him, her breath coming in short gasps. "Then tell me what to do. Tell me how to stop this." He shook his head, his jaw clenched. "You can't stop it. We can't stop it. The war between our kinds has been going on for centuries. I don't want to drag you into this, but I can't. But you can't let me go either," she finished for him, her voice sharp. Why are you holding on to me, Alistair? What is it that you want?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, gently cupping her face in his cold hands. His touch was like fire against her skin, an impossible combination of warmth and ice. "I want you," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "But I can't give you the life you deserve. I can't keep you in the darkness with me." His words shattered her heart, even as they resonated with the truth of their situation. She could feel the truth in his words, the conflict within him, the self-loathing, but she couldn't bring herself to let go. "I'm not afraid of the darkness," she said, her voice steady now. "I'm afraid of losing you." The tension between them continued to build, and the world outside their small sanctuary grew more hostile by the day. One night, the inevitable happened. A group of vampire hunters, more dangerous and well-organized than any they had faced before, descended on the library. Elara had known they would come eventually, but nothing could have prepared her for the viciousness of the attack. Alistair fought with a ferocity she had never seen before. His speed and power were terrifying, his rage a force that tore through the hunters as though they were paper. But even with all his power, Elara could see the strain in his eyes, the guilt and the agony of what he was becoming. "Get out of here, Elara!" he shouted, his voice a growl. "Leave now." "I won't leave you," she cried, her voice breaking as she watched him take down another hunter with a swift, brutal movement. The hunters were relentless, and soon it became clear that they were outmatched. Alistair's strength was beginning to falter, and Elara could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on them. In that moment of desperation, she made a decision that would change everything. She didn't know how she did it, or why, but she reached for the silver dagger she had found hidden among the weapons in the library. The hunters had used it on vampires before, and she knew its power. With trembling hands, Elara approached Alistair, who was momentarily distracted by another hunter. She pressed the dagger into his side, the cold silver biting into his flesh, and for the first time since they had met, he screamed in pain. "No!" she shouted, pulling the dagger away, but it was too late. Alistair collapsed to the ground, blood seeping from the wound. The vampire hunters paused, watching in disbelief as their quarry struggled to stand. Elara fell to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she touched the wound. "I didn't mean to," she began, but Alistair's voice interrupted her. "You saved me," he whispered, his eyes dark with both pain and gratitude. "I don't know whether I should be angry or thankful." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she pressed her forehead to his. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I just couldn't watch you die." The moonlight filtered through the shattered windows of the library as Alistair lay motionless, his body struggling to heal from the silver wound. Elara stayed by his side, her hands gently caressing his face, desperate to stop the bleeding. But the poison from the silver blade coursed through his veins, slowing his healing process. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice thick with fear. "You have to be." Alistair's eyes fluttered open, dark and unfathomable, yet filled with something softer, something human. His gaze met hers, and in that fleeting moment, Elara could see all the pain and burden he had carried for centuries. He was not just a vampire. He was a soul tortured by time, by guilt, and by a deep sense of isolation. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice hoarse, strained. "Why did you save me?" Elara didn't know how to answer. She only knew one thing. She couldn't lose him. "Because I love you," she said simply, though the words felt too small, too fragile for the enormity of her feelings. Alistair's lips parted in disbelief, but he didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched between them, filled with an unspoken understanding and an overwhelming tension. He wanted to say something, anything that could explain how he felt, but words failed him. His heart, though still capable of love, had been hardened by centuries of isolation and violence. How could he possibly explain this to her? "I can't let you die," Elara continued, her voice trembling. something else there, something darker. He knew that no matter how hard he tried, he would never be able to give her the life she deserved. He could never offer her the kind of future a human could have. His kind was a death sentence, and though she had never feared it, Alistair feared what it would do to her, how it would change her, consume her. "We can't keep doing this," he whispered, his voice filled with a bitter edge. "You deserve more than this, Elara. You deserve a life that's normal." "I don't want a normal life," she shot back, her frustration rising. "I want you." The fight between them hung heavily in the air as Alistair struggled with the guilt and self-loathing that came with his cursed existence. But as much as he fought it, he knew one thing: he couldn't walk away from her. He couldn't make her leave, not when she had already crossed that line, not when they had already crossed it together. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Alistair's wound, though painful, had begun to heal, but the toll it had taken on him was evident. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, his strength fading in ways he had never experienced before. The silver poison still lingered, but with Elara by his side, he was managing to fight it off. But the vampire hunters weren't done. They had tasted blood, and they wouldn't rest until they had eradicated every last trace of what they considered an abomination. The quiet moments Elara and Alistair shared were fleeting, and every night felt like the calm before the storm. It was on one such night that they were confronted with a harsh reality. A group of hunters, led by a man who was more ruthless and driven than any they had encountered, tracked them to the mansion where they had been hiding. This wasn't just an ambush, it was an execution. "Elara." Alistair's voice was urgent as he grabbed her wrist. "We have to leave. Now." But she couldn't. Not when it felt like the end of everything they had worked so hard to protect. "I won't run," she said, her voice filled with defiance. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not asking you to leave me behind, but we can't fight them here." "We're outnumbered," Alistair urged, his gaze dark with determination. Before Elara could respond, the door to the mansion shattered open, and the hunters stormed inside. There were at least a dozen of them, all armed with silver weapons, ready to strike. The battle that ensued was brutal. Alistair fought with all the power and skill of an ancient vampire, his movements blindingly fast, but even he couldn't evade the silver blades entirely. Elara, terrified but resolute, fought beside him, using the knowledge she had gained from her research to protect him. But it wasn't enough. As Alistair was pushed to the brink of exhaustion, Elara felt a surge of power she had never experienced before. In that moment of desperation, she called upon something deep inside herself, something that had lain dormant, hidden by her human limitations. A spark of magic, a gift from her ancestors, flared within her. She didn't understand it, but she knew it was the key to their survival. With a sudden, powerful movement, Elara summoned the magic she hadn't known she possessed. The room lit up with a blinding, white light, and the hunters recoiled in shock and fear. The power surged from her like a storm, knocking the hunters back and scattering them in every direction. Alistair, momentarily stunned, looked at her in disbelief. "Elara, what was that?" She collapsed to her knees, exhausted from the surge of energy. "I don't know," she whispered, panting for breath. "But we have to leave. We can't stay here." With the hunters driven off, the immediate danger had passed, but the consequences of their actions were just beginning to unfold. The world they lived in was changing. Elara's power, though new and raw, was undeniable. It had saved them both, but it came at a cost. Alistair, now more determined than ever, knew they couldn't keep running. The time for hiding was over. The vampire hunters were relentless, and with Elara's newfound abilities, they had become even more of a target. "Alistair," Elara began, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and resolve. "What happens now?" Alistair turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Now we face what's coming together." He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: there was no turning back now. The love they shared was as dangerous as it was deep, and it would either destroy them or make them stronger than they had ever been. But no matter what happened, they would face it side by side. The days following the battle with the vampire hunters were quiet, but the peace was fragile. Elara and Alistair had taken refuge in an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of the city, hidden from the world that had already begun to close in around them. The power Elara had unleashed was still fresh in her mind, and though it had saved them, it had also left her feeling exhausted and vulnerable. She had never imagined that she, a simple human, could possess such abilities. Her newfound power was both a blessing and a curse. She wasn't sure whether to embrace it or fear it. The magic inside her was wild, untamed, and she wasn't certain how to control it. Alistair, too, was concerned. While the magic had proven useful, he feared the consequences of wielding such power. Magic in the wrong hands could be just as dangerous as a vampire's thirst for blood. "You need to learn control," Alistair told her one evening as they sat in the drawing room of the mansion. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken thoughts, both of them acutely aware of the changes in their lives. "If you don't, it could consume you." "I don't want it to," Elara admitted softly, her fingers tracing the edges of the ancient book she had been reading. "But I don't know how to stop it either." Alistair's eyes softened, though there was still a trace of worry in them. He had seen firsthand the destructive potential of unchecked power. And while Elara was more than capable, he knew that the magic within her was still a mystery, a force she couldn't yet fully understand or control. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice steady. "I'll help you. I promise." The words were comforting, but Elara couldn't shake the feeling that their time together was running out. The world they lived in wasn't kind to those like them, and their love, impossible and forbidden, was a target for anyone who believed in the old laws. The vampire hunters would return, stronger and more determined than ever. And there were darker forces in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, as the wind howled through the broken windows of the mansion, Elara found herself standing in front of the mirror in the dimly lit hallway. Her reflection stared back at her, and for the first time in weeks, she hardly recognized the person she saw. The magic that had awakened inside her was changing her. She could feel it in her blood, in the way her senses had sharpened, in the way her body responded to the pull of Alistair's presence. She turned away from the mirror, unable to face the uncertainty of her own transformation. She had never asked for this power, yet it had become a part of her. And now, as the darkness of the world closed in, she had to decide whether she would embrace it or let it consume her. That night, Alistair found her standing in the garden, her face turned towards the sky. The moonlight bathed her in a soft, ethereal glow, and for a brief moment, she looked like something otherworldly, a creature caught between two worlds. "Elara." Alistair's voice broke the silence, low and cautious. She didn't turn to look at him immediately. Instead, she stared at the sky, her thoughts heavy. "Alistair, I don't know what to do anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not just human anymore. I can feel it. The magic inside me, it's changing me. And I don't know if I can control it. I don't know if I want to." Alistair stepped closer, his footsteps soft against the grass. "I've seen what this power can do, Elara," he said gently. "And I've seen the darkness it can bring. But you are stronger than you think. I believe in you." She finally turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "But what if I'm wrong? What if the magic overtakes me? What if it destroys everything we've built?" His gaze softened, and for a moment he looked like the man he once was, someone capable of love, of hope. "Then we fight it together. We face the consequences together. Because we are together." Elara's heart fluttered at his words, but the weight of her decision still pressed heavily on her chest. "I don't want to lose you, Alistair. I don't want to become something other." "You won't lose me," he replied, his voice firm. "Not as long as you choose to stay with me." In that moment, Elara realized the truth. She had always been in control of her own destiny, even if it didn't seem that way. The power inside her was a reflection of her strength, and she could choose how to wield it. She didn't have to be afraid of it, and she didn't have to face it alone. But her choices were far from over. The world was still watching, waiting for the right moment to tear them apart. And now, Elara had to choose whether to remain hidden in the shadows with Alistair or step into the light and face the storm that was coming. The decision Elara made that night set the course for everything that was to come. She would no longer run from her power or the reality of the world she had stepped into. But that didn't mean the fight was over. The vampire hunters had learned of her abilities, and they were more determined than ever to destroy her and anyone who dared to stand in their way. But there were other forces at play as well. Far more ancient and powerful than the vampire hunters, there were those who saw Elara's magic as a potential weapon that could tip the balance of power in the eternal war between humans and vampires. They watched from the shadows, waiting for the moment when they could strike. Alistair and Elara knew that their time together was limited. The coming war would test their bond in ways they couldn't even imagine. The power within Elara would either destroy them or save them, and the fate of both their worlds rested in her hands. As the first battle lines were drawn, Elara and Alistair stood side by side, ready to face the chaos that awaited them. The storm was here, and this time they weren't hiding. The first whispers of rebellion came from within. Alistair had known that the vampire world was fractured, divided by centuries of war and betrayal, but he never imagined that someone within his own ranks would turn on them so soon. A trusted ally, a fellow vampire named Cassius, whom Alistair had once considered a brother, had betrayed them. He had been one of the oldest vampires in their coven, a leader among their kind, and Alistair had always believed him to be a loyal friend. But Cassius had other plans. He saw the power Elara possessed as a threat, a force that could unbalance the fragile peace that the vampires had managed to maintain after centuries of war. "I should have known," Alistair muttered under his breath as they fled through the streets, with Elara close behind him. The air was thick with tension, and the feeling of impending doom hung like a storm cloud over them. Cassius never liked the idea of humans and vampires working together. He never believed in us. Elara's eyes widened with disbelief. "But he helped us. He saved us." "That was a lie," Alistair snapped, his voice darkening with anger. "It was all part of his plan. He's working with the vampire hunters now, using them to hunt us down." Elara felt a pang of betrayal deep in her chest. She had trusted Cassius, had believed in the fragile alliances that had formed between the vampires and the humans. But now it seemed that everything was falling apart. The world she thought she understood had been built on lies, and the future she had hoped for with Alistair was slipping further and further away. "We can't keep running, Alistair," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "We need to take a stand. We need to fight." Alistair looked at her, his expression torn. He knew what was at stake. "You don't understand, Elara. This is bigger than you and me. Cassius has powerful allies. We're not just fighting hunters anymore, we're fighting against everything we've ever known." The night was filled with chaos as Alistair and Elara were forced into hiding once again. They couldn't trust anyone, not even the vampires who had once been their allies. Cassius had made sure of that, spreading rumors and lies to turn their own kind against them. The war between the two species had escalated beyond anyone's control, and now Elara and Alistair were caught in the middle of it all. As they took refuge in the ruins of an old castle deep in the forest, far from prying eyes, Elara couldn't help but wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. The magic inside her was growing stronger with each passing day, and she could feel it coursing through her veins, pulling her further away from the woman she once was. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice tinged with guilt. "What if this magic is going to destroy us all? What if I can't control it?" Alistair stepped forward, his hands gently resting on her shoulders. His touch was a reminder of the humanity she still held onto, even as everything around her seemed to spiral out of control. "You don't have to control it," he said softly. "You just have to accept it." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that Elara couldn't ignore. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of clarity. She didn't need to be afraid of the power inside her. She needed to embrace it, to use it to protect the people she loved, especially Alistair. But even as she made this decision, Elara knew that their love would come at a great cost. The magic inside her, the strength she had only just begun to understand, was tied to something much darker than she had realized. And with every passing day, it was becoming harder and harder to keep the darkness at bay. The war was nearing its climax. The vampire hunters, under the command of Cassius, were closing in on Elara and Alistair. The battle for control over the magic that Elara possessed had become more brutal, more personal than either of them had anticipated. Their enemies were no longer faceless, nameless threats. They were people they had once trusted, people who had betrayed them for the sake of power. It was in the heart of the battlefield, as the skies above darkened and the ground trembled beneath their feet, that Elara and Alistair made their final stand. They had gathered all the strength they could muster, and now they had to face the consequences of their actions. Cassius appeared on the battlefield, flanked by his most loyal followers. His eyes glinted with a cold fury, and Elara could see the madness in them. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. "Alistair," Cassius called out, his voice like a venomous snake's is. "You were a fool to think you could change things. This war was inevitable. You were the one who allowed a human to come between us." "You don't understand, Cassius," Alistair replied, his voice calm despite the tension. "It's not about human or vampire. It's about us, the world we choose to live in." Cassius laughed bitterly. "You are weak, and you've always been. I will not let you destroy everything we've worked for." The battle erupted in an instant, the vampires and hunters clashing with a fury that shook the very ground beneath them. Elara and Alistair fought side by side, their bond stronger than ever, but the odds were against them. Cassius and his followers were relentless, and every strike they made seemed to bring them closer to defeat. And then, as the chaos reached its peak, Elara felt the magic inside her flare once again, stronger, more powerful than ever before. She could feel the darkness creeping in, threatening to consume her, but this time she welcomed it. She had no choice. With a final cry, she unleashed the full force of her power. The battlefield erupted in a blinding light, and when it faded, silence fell. Cassius lay on the ground, his body still and lifeless. The vampire hunters were scattered, their morale shattered. Elara stood, panting, her eyes wide with shock at what she had just done. Alistair was at her side in an instant, his face filled with concern. "Elara, are you?" "I did it," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I killed him." Alistair's gaze softened, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes. "You didn't have a choice." But Elara knew that she had. The power inside her had come at a price. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had killed not just an enemy, but a part of herself. The magic, though powerful, had taken something from her, and she wasn't sure if she could ever get it back. In the aftermath of the battle, Elara and Alistair stood together, surveying the destruction around them. The war was over, but the cost had been great. The world they had fought for was shattered, and the future they had dreamed of seemed uncertain. But as they looked into each other's eyes, they knew that they had survived together. No matter what the future held, they had each other. And for now, that was enough. The aftermath of the battle left Elara and Alistair with no time to rest. Though the immediate threat of Cassius and the vampire hunters had been quelled, the larger forces at play had only just begun to stir. Unbeknownst to them, Cassius had been only one part of a much larger, much more dangerous network, a network that stretched deep into the heart of the vampire world. And now, with his death, the vacuum he left behind had begun to attract the attention of a group far more ancient and powerful, the Dark Council. The Dark Council was a secret group of the oldest vampires, beings who had ruled in the shadows for millennia and who believed in the pure, untainted blood of their kind. They saw humans as nothing more than tools to be used or discarded, and any vampire who fraternized with a human was considered a traitor. Cassius had been one of their most loyal servants, and his death had sent shockwaves through their ranks. Alistair had heard whispers of the council, but he had never thought they would turn their eyes on him, especially not now, after everything that had happened. One evening, as Elara and Alistair sat in the ruins of an old sanctuary they had taken refuge in, the air grew unnaturally still. The moon above was hidden by thick clouds, casting the world below into a dense, suffocating darkness. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, moving with a grace that was both unnerving and familiar. Elara's hand instinctively went to the dagger she had kept by her side, but Alistair held his hand up to stop her. "You've been running for far too long," the figure said, their voice soft but filled with power. The figure stepped into the dim light, revealing a tall vampire, his eyes glowing with an ancient, unsettling light. His face was regal, carved from the very stone of the earth itself, and his aura radiated a chilling authority. He was one of them, a member of the Dark Council. "Lord Varen," Alistair muttered, his voice dark with both respect and disdain. The vampire lord smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "You are a fool to think you could escape the inevitable, Alistair. The council has been watching you for centuries. Your betrayal has not gone unnoticed." Elara looked between them, feeling a rising sense of dread. "Betrayal?" she asked, her voice a mix of confusion and fear. "What do you mean?" Lord Varen's smile grew wider, more malicious. "Your relationship with this human, Alistair, is not just a personal failure. It is a crime against all vampires. You have broken the ancient laws, and for that you will be judged." The council's reach was far greater than Alistair had ever anticipated. Lord Varen, one of the most powerful members of the Dark Council, was not here for a simple confrontation. He was here to deliver a message. "You have caused a rift in the very fabric of our kind's existence," Varen continued, his voice low and filled with venom. "The moment you allowed a human to stand beside you, you condemned both your kind and hers. You should have known better, Alistair. You were once one of us. You knew the consequences of defying the laws that have governed us for centuries." Elara stepped forward, her hands still clutching the dagger, but there was no hiding the fear in her eyes. She had never heard of the Dark Council, but the weight of their power was unmistakable. "You can't be serious," she said, trying to steady her voice. "We are not your enemies. We only want to live in peace." "Peace?" Lord Varen laughed darkly, his eyes narrowing. You speak of peace, but what you truly seek is an abomination. Do you not understand the cost of your existence together? The war between vampires and humans has been ongoing for centuries. And now you have awakened the wrath of those who will never allow such a union. Alistair's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight with restrained fury. He had known the risks of being with Elara, but he had never imagined that the consequences would reach this level. What do you want, Varen? Alistair asked through gritted teeth. We want you to return to the fold, Varen said. Submit to the Council's will, renounce your relationship with this human, and allow us to purge her from your life. If you do this, you may still be allowed to live. If not, your life, along with hers, will be forfeit. Elara's heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time, she felt truly powerless. The Council was not just a threat, it was a force that could destroy everything they had worked for, everything they had sacrificed. Her future with Alistair seemed to hang in the balance, and she wasn't sure if there was any way out. You will not destroy her, Alistair said firmly, stepping in front of Elara, his voice low and cold. I will not let you. If I must die to protect her, I will. Varen's gaze flickered to Elara, and for the briefest moment, there was a flicker of something darker, something ancient and terrible in his eyes. You think you can defy us? Varen asked, his tone mocking. You are nothing compared to the might of the Council. You have made your choice, Alistair, and now you will face the consequences. With a swift motion, Varen raised his hand, and a wave of dark energy surged toward them. It was like being struck by a storm, wild, destructive, and uncontrollable. But before the energy could reach them, Elara felt the magic inside her stir, burning like fire. She reached out instinctively, her power responding to the threat, and with a violent burst of energy, she deflected the attack. The blast of energy ricocheted off her magic, creating an explosion of light that sent Varen stumbling back. You will not take him from me, Elara said, her voice trembling but filled with fierce resolve. Varen's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, it seemed as though even he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Elara had not only protected herself, but she had sent a force powerful enough to cause him to stagger. I underestimated you, he growled, wiping the blood from his lip. But this changes nothing. The Council will come for you, Elara, and they will destroy everything you hold dear. With a final, seething glance, Varen disappeared into the shadows, leaving them alone, but not unscathed. The threat of the Dark Council was now very real, and both Elara and Alistair knew that their world had irrevocably changed. Varen's warning echoed in their minds, the weight of the Council's power looming over them. Their fight for survival had only just begun. Elara, Alistair said quietly, turning to face her after the storm had settled. This is it. We can't hide anymore. We've crossed a line that we can't uncross. I know, Elara whispered, her voice soft but filled with an unyielding resolve. And I won't run. We fight. Together. The war between humans and vampires was no longer a distant threat, it was at their doorstep. And they would stand and face it no matter the cost. The days following the encounter with Lord Varen were filled with an unsettling silence. Elara and Alistair knew that the Dark Council would not stop until they had torn their bond apart. Their power, once a source of refuge, now felt like a target on their backs. Every whisper in the night, every flicker of movement in the shadows felt like an omen, warning them of the storm that was coming. But they weren't going to run anymore. No more hiding. No more waiting for the inevitable. I won't let them take you, Alistair said, his voice cold and resolute as they prepared for what was to come. The Council thinks they can destroy us, but they underestimate the power we have together. You've already proven that. Elara nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of an old map spread out before them. We need allies, she said, her voice steady. We need to unite the humans who still believe in what we fought for. They're not all our enemies. We can't do this alone. Alistair's eyes darkened. I've never trusted humans to fight alongside vampires. They see us as monsters. Then we'll prove them wrong, Elara replied firmly. We'll show them that we're more than what they think we are. That we fight for something greater than ourselves. And so, they began the task of gathering those who would stand with them. Elara reached out to the remnants of human resistance, those who had fought the vampire hunters in the past but had given up hope. She spoke to those who had witnessed the atrocities of the Dark Council and its followers and rallied them to her cause. At the same time, Alistair sought out old allies, vampires who had once fought against the tyranny of their own kind. There were few, but they were the ones who had once believed that there was a chance for peace. Together, they began to form a coalition, one built on the fragile hope that a united front could break the cycle of hatred and violence. But as they began to build their army, they quickly realized that they weren't the only ones gathering forces. The Dark Council had sent their own emissaries to recruit allies, some willing, others coerced. There was no mercy in the coming war and no room for hesitation. The alliance between humans and vampires was tenuous at best. There were moments of unity, but the distrust between the two sides was palpable. It wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a battle for the future of their existence. What would the world look like after the war? Would it be one where both humans and vampires could coexist? Or would it be one where only the strongest would survive? The first real confrontation came sooner than they had expected. As they gathered their forces in an ancient temple hidden deep within the mountains, the ground beneath them trembled. The storm that had been brewing for so long had finally broken. Vampires and humans stood together, side by side, preparing for what they knew could be their last stand. The Dark Council had dispatched its most formidable warriors, and the battlefield was set. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the sounds of weapons being prepared and the murmurs of soldiers readying themselves for the fight of their lives. Elara and Alistair stood together, facing the coming chaos. Elara's magic was still raw, but she had learned to harness it, to use it to protect those she loved. Alistair, once a leader of the vampires, now found himself leading a group that included both humans and vampires. The weight of the task felt heavier than ever. Elara, Alistair said, his voice softer now, a rare moment of tenderness between them amidst the looming storm. Whatever happens, know that I will always be by your side. I know, she whispered, her hand brushing against his. And I'll fight with everything I have. The battle raged on, and soon the sky itself seemed to crack open, thunder roaring above as vampires and humans clashed in a violent frenzy. Magic crackled through the air, dark and light intertwining as the two forces fought for control. The ground was soaked with blood, both human and vampire, as the conflict reached its peak. Elara and Alistair fought together, side by side, their strength amplified by their bond. Elara's magic shielded them from the worst of the attacks, while Alistair fought with a ferocity that came from years of surviving in a world that had tried to destroy him. But even with their combined strength, they were overwhelmed. The Dark Council's forces were too strong, their numbers too great. As the battle raged on, it became clear that victory would not come without a price. Elara and Alistair, battered and bruised, found themselves cornered by Lord Varen and his most loyal followers. The last remnants of their army had fallen, and only a handful of fighters remained. "We end this now," Varen said, his voice cold and merciless as he stepped forward. "You fought bravely, but it is over." Alistair stepped in front of Elara, his eyes blazing with defiance. "You may have won this battle, but you won't win the war. You will never break us." Varen's eyes narrowed. "We don't need to break you. We just need to end you." Elara felt the power inside her surge once again, stronger than it had ever been before. But she knew that the cost of unleashing it could be devastating, not just for their enemies, but for her as well. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice trembling but filled with determination. Alistair turned to her, his face filled with concern. "Elara, don't you?" But it was too late. The magic within her burst free, enveloping the battlefield in blinding light. The force of her power was enough to push back the Council's forces, but it came with a cost. The energy left her weakened, her body trembling from the exertion. In that moment, Elara knew that to end this war, to give them the chance to truly be free, there would be a sacrifice, one that might cost her everything. The battle was far from over, but Elara and Alistair had reached a crossroads. The power inside her had reached its peak, and now, the only way to stop the war, to end the cycle of bloodshed, was to make a choice that would change everything. Elara stood in the center of the battlefield, the raw power she had unleashed coursing through her veins. Her heart was pounding, but she could feel the cost of her magic. Her body was breaking down under the strain. The light around her faded, leaving only the remnants of her magic lingering in the air like a whisper. Alistair rushed to her side, his face a mix of fear and awe. "Elara," he whispered, his voice shaking with emotion. "You've done enough. This isn't the way." But Elara knew better. She could feel the darkness closing in. The Dark Council would not stop until they were all destroyed. If she didn't do this now, if she didn't make the ultimate sacrifice, everything they had fought for would be lost. She could feel her magic growing unstable, the power within her threatening to consume everything in its path. "This is the only way," Elara said, her voice soft but firm. "I can't let them win. barely a whisper. But we both know I can't walk away from this. The war ends with me. As she spoke, the battlefield around them seemed to pause. The screams of battle faded, the sounds of weapons clashing slowly quieting, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Elara closed her eyes, drawing on the last of her strength. The magic inside her swelled one final time, the pure energy of her love for Alistair, her hope for a future that could never be fully realized, pouring into the spell she was about to cast. The air crackled with power, and for a moment she felt as if she were one with everything, the earth beneath her, the sky above, the souls of the living and the dead. "Goodbye, Alistair," she whispered, her lips trembling. "I'll always love you." And then, with a final surge of power, Elara released the magic. The energy radiated outward in a blinding wave of light, reaching across the battlefield, engulfing everything in its path. The Dark Council's forces screamed as they were caught in the spell, their bodies disintegrating into nothingness. Even Lord Baron, the embodiment of ancient power, fell to the force of her sacrifice, his form crumbling into ash. For a long moment, the battlefield was silent. When the light finally faded, the world was still. Elara collapsed into Alistair's arms, her body trembling and frail, but her face serene. He held her, tears flowing freely, not caring that their world had been forever changed. They had won, but at what cost? Elara, no. Alistair's voice was broken, the weight of everything settling on his shoulders. "Please, don't leave me." Elara's eyes fluttered open one last time, her lips curling into a faint smile. "It's over now. The world is free." Her hand gently brushed his cheek, and for a brief, fleeting moment, it was as though she was still the woman he had known, the woman he had loved. "We made it," she whispered. "We made it." With that, her eyes closed, her body finally succumbing to the toll of her sacrifice. Alistair held her close, not caring about the aftermath, not caring about the new world that awaited them. All that mattered was the love they had shared and the love that would live on in his heart, even if she was no longer there. The war was over. But the price of peace was a heavy one. Years passed and the world began to heal. The war between humans and vampires, once thought eternal, was over. The Dark Council was no more, and the fragile alliance between humans and vampires was given a chance to grow, to build a future free from the shadows of the past. Alistair lived on, though time seemed to move differently for him now. He was no longer the cold, detached vampire he once was. The love he had shared with Elara had transformed him, made him see the world in a new light. And though he carried the weight of her sacrifice with him, he also carried the memory of her courage, of her strength, and of her love. One quiet evening, as the sun began to set, Alistair stood on a hill overlooking a city that had been rebuilt from the ashes of war. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, and for the first time in centuries, Alistair felt at peace. The world was different now, more open, more united. There was still work to be done, still wounds to heal, but the future was no longer clouded with hatred. Humans and vampires, once enemies, now walked side by side, their futures intertwined. And in the quiet of the evening, Alistair closed his eyes and whispered a prayer for Lara. His heart still ached for her, but he knew she had given everything for this world, the world they had both dreamed of. "Rest well, my love."